Put your seatbelts on and get ready for the ride. We're the freaking New York Jets, so we're built for this shit.
Hello, welcome to another episode of In the Trenches with Gang Green. I'm your host, Bubbs. Today is Thursday, April 3rd. Hopefully everybody's having a good day so far today. This is episode 517 of the In the Trenches with Gang Green podcast. I thank you, as always, for joining me. For those tuning in on YouTube, make sure to please like and subscribe. Of course, appreciate all of those tuning in on all the different audio podcast platforms. And today, we've got a few New York Jets topics to discuss, some NFL draft talk, and also wanted to dive in on some things with running back Breece Hall a little bit later on in the podcast. We'll start today, though. Field Yates created a 2-round mock draft, his latest mock draft, and I wanted to break down the 2 picks that he has for the New York Jets at 7th overall and 42nd overall. So we'll break that down here to open up today's podcast. As always, though, before we begin, we've got to get into our podcast partners, starting with our friends over at BetUS, America's favorite online sportsbook. If you want to get in on any of the sports betting action, check out BetUS and use my link in the description of this video to get a 125% sign-up bonus on your first 3 deposits up to $2,000. Also, our friends over at SeatGeek, if you want any of the best tickets in sports or entertainment, check out SeatGeek. And if you're a first-time SeatGeek user, use my promo code BUBSONSPORTS for $20 off your first purchase and get yourself out to some awesome events. And also our friends over at Huga House, if you want any of their new arrival or originals, hats and sweatshirts, check them out and use code BUBS for 15% off any purchase and get yourself some awesome Huga House swag. So here we go, episode 517. Thank you as always for tuning in. Field Yates, an NFL draft analyst, of course, for ESPN, has revealed his latest mock draft, and it was a 2-round mock draft. April draft month, things are heating up, so wanted to break it down today on the podcast, both who the Jets he had taking at 7th and who he had taking at 42nd, and of course, we'll get into some Breece Hall stuff as well a little bit later on in today's program. But I wanted to start here with the draft stuff. And Field Yates, in his mock draft, first round pick 7, had the New York Jets taking Armand Membou. Here was what Field Yates had to say on the Jets taking Membou. We'll throw it up on the screen here for the YouTube audience. The free agent signing of Justin Fields means the Jets have a quarterback solution for at least 2025. But the loss of Morgan Moses in free agency means they have a hole at right tackle. New York already had pass protection issues, finishing 23rd in pass block win rate last season, 57.1% as a team. Membou had a meteoric rise in 2024 as the 20-year-old dominated the SEC with tenacity, elite movement skills, and pass protection proficiency. He can be a tone setter up front, joining Olu Fashanu to give New York a pair of talented young offensive tackles. I think that last part really hits home to why a lot of Jet fans, even if you're not on board with getting Membou or already are on board with potentially taking Membou at number 7, makes sense, is that possibility of having Olu at left tackle, who, if he plays like he did in the few games he started last year towards the tail end of the season, you have your guy at left tackle. And in a perfect world, Membou comes in and is your right tackle, and the 2 biggest foundational pieces to your offensive line are set for the next 10, 15 years with Olu and Membu at left and right tackle. That, I think, is one of the biggest reasons for optimism around this possible move. I will also say this too, right? I'm totally on board with the New York Jets taking Armand Membu. I've said this many times. I think there is a big four guys that I think most Jet fans should get on board with, should be okay with, most realistic options for the Jets if they were there at number 7. Armand Membu, Tet McMillan, Tyler Warren, Mason Graham. All 4 positions of need. All 4 you can make a strong case. If they're there at 7, the Jets should take them. And I'm fine with any of those guys. Now, Membu himself, right, 6'4", 332 pounds. We've spent a ton of time talking about him. I think most people know what Membu brings to the table. Junior out of Missouri. Last season, a 90.6 Pro Football Focus grade, 800 snaps at right tackle. He is a pure right tackle, comes in, fits what you need right away. Very athletic. You look at some of his athletic, metrics and numbers, very impressive. Next Gen Stats has him at an athleticism score of 94, which ranks first among this draft class among all offensive tackles, both right and left. He also had an 87.6 run block grade last year, 86.6 pass block grade, an 87.4 zone blocking grade, 76.6 gap grade, and an 82.2 true pass set pass block grade. Did not allow a sack last year or a QB hit, just allowed only 8 quarterback hurries in 12 games. Has only allowed 3 sacks in his career, along with, of course, the 23 hurries. Never allowed a quarterback hit. So this is a guy to me that's very well rounded. If you had to say his strength, it would be run blocking. But even as a pass blocker, he's still very solid. He's a well-rounded, well-oiled machine, very athletic, run blocking, pass protection, fits both of those perfectly. Good hands and body control, especially when he's in those pass pro. One of the weaknesses, if you had to say with Membu, would be his size, right? Only 6'4", not the biggest guy, and at times can struggle against bull rushers. But I think this would be a pick that a lot of Jet fans, myself included, we've talked about him a lot, would be totally on board with the Jets getting. And the idea of him and Olu being your left tackle, right tackle for the next 10, 15 years is huge. Plus all the other young pieces you already have on this offensive line. We've talked about this a ton. John Simpson is the oldest offensive lineman now that Morgan Moses is gone, and he's 27 years old. Right? You have a young Joe Tippmann. John Simpson's in the prime of his career. AVT, even though he's entering, year number, 5 here for this New York Jets team, only 25 years old. You add another young core blue chip piece, ideally, here with Membu. Now, the next pick here for the Jets, you go Membu, which now opens up the table, right? The Jets, I believe, and I think many other people would believe, and not really believe, they have to. You've got to find a legitimate blue chip piece in round 1, and then you've got to find 2 to 3 starters in day 2 and an even early day 3, just because of the amount of holes that this team has on their roster. So you take the tackle in round 1, it now opens up the door here, 42nd overall. Where do you go? Do you go tight end? Do you go wide receiver? Do you go defensive line? What's the move here? Field Yates has the New York Jets going tight end, drafting Mason Taylor out of LSU. Here's what he had to say. I considered Tyler Warren for the Jets at number 7 before going with Membu. So picking Taylor 1 round later makes sense to fill a hole at tight end. He has exceptional hands and can handle inline blocking duties. Taylor actually has a small connection to the Jets, very small, right? His father, Jason Taylor, spent 1 season with the Jets in his Hall of Fame career in 2010. Mason Taylor, of course, with this, would also become a Jet here. 6'5", 251 pounds junior. When you look at some of his numbers last year, 55 receptions, 546 yards, 9.9 yards per reception, 2 touchdowns. On top of that, finished the year with a 67.8 overall grade, just a 1.8% drop rate which was really solid, upper echelon percentile rankings among all tight ends with 25 plus targets, had a 50% contested catch rate. And some numbers that stick out to me had 3 deep catches, which was tied for 23rd, and had 8 contested catches, which was tied for 8th. Mason Taylor is a guy in his career, 129 receptions, 1,308 yards, 10.1 yards per reception, 6 touchdowns. What makes him an intriguing piece that the Jets could potentially a slot option, right? There is a few tight ends in this draft that are strictly inline. Then you have your guys that are mainly just slot, like your Harold Fannin Jr. is more of your just big body slot, not much of a blocker, but is going to be excellent as a receiver. Mason Taylor, not to the level of Tyler Warren, but for a day 2 guy, has the ability to produce as a slot with receiving upside, and also has the ability to do some positive things as an inline blocker as well at the tight end spot, where you're able to get a pretty solid balance here on day 2, with the hope that he could potentially develop both of those traits into much higher NFL caliber level play. Very athletic as well, and has some speed, which I think is something to look for. Ran a 4.65 40-yard dash, which was the fastest in this tight end class. And something that I think, again, tight end, some speed, can block a bit, I think gives you, he's a good option. Him, Terrence Ferguson, you want to go Fannin Jr., Gunnar Helm, whatever. You can go down the list of day 2 tight end options like Elijah Arroyo, another one out of Miami. Mason Taylor also in there. I would be okay with coming away with any of those guys. And Taylor's pretty balanced. You know, athletic, good hands, some of these strengths, size 6'5", right? We talked about that contested catchability. I think is something that's pretty underrated. And that ability, too, to play in line as a blocker and also do some good things in the slot just as a receiver with some of that receiving upside, where you saw him put up a career high in the SEC last year with 546 receiving yards. Some of his weaknesses, single coverage struggles. I plucked this number from PFF. Good against zone, but just 29th percentile against single coverage, something he'd have to work on in the NFL. And you'd also probably have to see him put on a little bit more weight to truly be a successful inline tight end blocker. Right now, coming in at just about 251, put on an extra 10, 15 pounds, get to about 260, 265. I think you're looking at that range where you can fully rely on him to be able to keep that athleticism, keep that speed, but also put on a little bit more size to produce a little bit more as a blocker. Mason Taylor, I think, is a very quality option if you don't go Tyler Warren day 1. And there's others as well. It's not just Taylor, but I would be okay if the Jets came away with Mason Taylor. So that was Field Yates' 2-round mock draft. Armand Membu, Mason Taylor, right? You get those 2 guys, you'd assume then, your 3rd-round pick, 73rd overall, you're probably looking at some combination of wide receiver, defensive line at that point, because you've already checked 2 boxes with tight end and tackle. So, of course, a lot of other holes there to fill as well. Realistically, though, look, Muji and Glenn have pressure. They've got to find 3 starters at least with the first 3 picks. And ideally, that first pick, whether it's Warren, whether it's McMillan, whether it's Graham, whether it's Membu, is a blue chip piece that isn't just a starter, but an elite caliber player for the next 10, 15 years here. And a guy that can really be a foundational piece for this team moving forward with this regime as they retool, reset. So that's the draft stuff. Now, I wanted to get into some Breece Hall stuff because Breece Hall has actually kind of been amongst some Jet fan chatter over the last couple of days. It all kind of started with Aaron Glenn had a comment about the running back room, which we'll throw up here on the screen in a second, on Monday at the NFL owner meetings that I touched upon a little bit, but wanted to dive a little bit more into today on the podcast. You've also started to hear some trade rumblings around the possibility of the Jets dealing Breece Hall, right? You've heard, some connections with the Broncos, Muji obviously coming over there, Broncos needing a running back, Aaron Glenn's comments, the way things can be run with this offense where it's more of a running back by committee, and the Jets could be in the state of mind of maybe not bringing back Breece Hall right at the end, at the last year of his contract here, where you don't have the fifth-year option because he wasn't a first-round pick. So you look at him and say, you're not going to, bring him back next year. Do you deal him now and go running back by committee with the rest of the room? I don't think they're going to do anything crazy by Gentry. I'll just keep it short like this. From the trade aspect, I don't see Breece Hall being dealt. I would not deal him. To me, it doesn't make sense. I've said this many times. Why create more holes on your roster than you need to? I like Braylon Allen a lot, but I would not feel very confident in Braylon Allen going into the season as the number one. In year number two, I think he is a perfect number two behind Breece. I don't think you should ask Braylon Allen to go out there next year and be a number one option. I think him and Breece Hall complement each other really well. Braylon Allen's that downhill physical short yardage guy. Breece is that do-it-all guy. You also throw Isaiah Davis into the mix. I think the running back room is good as it is right now, and I don't think there's any reason to deal him. Personally, just keep good talent on this roster, I think is important. You don't want to create more holes. You don't want to move on from good pieces just because, in my opinion. That's how I see it. Either way, though, Aaron Glenn's comments, have some people wondering how this running back room is going to be used. And I wanted to break it down and kind of break down what he might be thinking and how it compares a little bit to Tanner Engstrand's background in Detroit, also throwing Fields into the mix and how things can be utilized this year when it comes to the Jets rushing offense. So here was Aaron Glenn. He said, quote, "I think mentally he's in a good place, but I would say that we have 3 running backs on this team that we're going to utilize as much as possible." When you look at the Jets right now, right, Breece Hall, Braylon Allen, Isaiah Davis, and you look at where Tanner Engstrand is coming from, you really shouldn't be too surprised when you look at the possibility of how this running back room is going to be structured this year for the Jets. And it by no means does not mean that Breece Hall is not going to be the number one featured running back. I think this quote and the expectation for this offense is more so Braylon Allen and Isaiah Davis are going to get bigger roles because, frankly, last year, especially Braylon Allen and even Breece Hall, the Jets' run game as a whole, were not utilized nearly enough. And when you look at Detroit and where Tanner Engstrand's coming from, because he's the biggest piece of this puzzle as the offensive coordinator, the play caller, they utilized 2 running backs very frequently at high rates, and they were both very successful. Now, I want to break down some numbers to back this stuff up. The Jets rushing offense, let's just set the background here. Jets rushing offense last year, 1,561 rushing yards as a team, which was 91.8 yards per game. Both ranked 31st in the NFL. The Jets as a team ranked 32nd in the NFL in attempts with 363. It was awful, right? We talk about it all the time. It got to the point where it was the Aaron Rodgers show towards the end of the season where it was just him throwing the ball 40 times per game and chucking it to Devontae Adams because he was down there somewhere as he tried to get his 500 touchdown. It was awful, awful football to watch. Also, how many times were the Jets in third and short situations and Nathaniel Hackett or Todd Downing wouldn't give the ball to Braylon Allen and instead try something else and it wouldn't work? It was pathetic. The coaching was awful. Even if Tanner Engstrand is average, he's better than what the Jets have had over the last 2 seasons. Now, from a Lions perspective, you look at some of the rushing numbers. And I'll say this. I think actually the Lions offense as a whole sometimes gets mixed up. I think a lot of people look at the Lions as like a pass-heavy team, which they are. But they also run the ball, I think, a lot more than some people realize. Last year, 2,488 rushing yards, 146.4 yards per game, both 6th in the NFL. And as a team, they ran the ball 534 times, which was third in the NFL. And in fact, it was 34 more times that they ran the ball last year than they did the year prior in 2023, where they ran it 500 times. The reason I bring this all up, number one, expect the Jets next year to utilize the run game a lot more. As much as Aaron Glenn talks a lot about wanting Fields to develop more as a passer and allowing him to really take off as a passer, because you look at the way he's been used, you watch some of the film, you watch some of the offenses that he's been in Chicago and in last year with Arthur Smith in Pittsburgh, a lot of these teams kind of like handcuffed him a little bit, where it was, hey, don't make mistakes, play conservative, short, quick passes, utilize your legs, game manage, essentially. Especially last year when you look at Pittsburgh. Like, you go back, and I rewatched all 6 of his starts. You go back and see some of the ways that Pittsburgh was running the offense with him. It was basically like, hey, don't make mistakes, just play competent football and until we get Russ back. That was essentially what Arthur Smith and that offense was asking him to do. Right, which is why he played a very low, only 1 interception in those 6 starts, very low mistake-free football, but the numbers, the yards weren't that inflated because they weren't asking him to do that. Not saying the Jets are going to ask him to go out there this year and throw for 4,500 yards and 45 touchdowns. That's not what you should expect, but I do think they're going to let him air the ball out a lot more, take a little bit more risk, take more chances, throw the ball more, but they're still going to be a run-first team because even at his best trait will still be his legs, and that is Justin Fields. So the point I bring up here is, I think when Glenn, you look at that quote and you just look at Breece Hall roles going into the season, I think it's going to be very similar to what we saw in 2 areas. I think the Jets' running game is going to be very similar to the way we saw things in Detroit, where it's going to be Breece and Braylon Allen, similar to Gibbs and David Montgomery. I'll also say the RPOs and the heavy use of quarterback runs and also Breece Hall getting involved is going to be similar to what we've seen in Baltimore all these years with Lamar. I'm not saying that the Jets are going to be a mix of the Ravens offense and Lions offense in terms of success. No, they will not be the Lions or Ravens offense next year. In a perfect world, great. Yes, they're a top 5 offense, but realistically, no. But what I'm saying is that'll be kind of their design. And I think the numbers kind of back up and project potentially what Breece Hall you could be looking for this season. So let's look at the last 2 years. Breece Hall, when you look at his carries, they've been low. But compared to the whole team, it's he's gotten the ball the most out of anybody by a lot. 223 of the team's 388 carries in 2023 came from Breece Hall. That's 57.4% of the team's carries were given to Breece Hall. To put into perspective, Dalvin Cook was the 2nd highest carries on the Jets in 2023. Just shows you how sad that team turned out to be. Dalvin Cook had 67 carries on 388 of the team's attempts. That was 17.2%. So Breece led the way with 57.4% of the carries. The next closest was 17.2%. You look at 2024, 209 carries of the team's 363, which was 57.5%, just about the same range as he had in 2023. He did play a game less. You look at 2024, and next to Breece Hall was Braylon Allen. 92 carries, 360, or 92 of the team's 363 carries, 25.3%. So Breece in back-to-back years had 57% of the team's carries, and the player behind him, 17.2% and 25.3%. To put this in perspective for what the Lions were dealing with, Gibbs actually, in 2023, had less carries than David Montgomery. Gibbs had 182 of the team's 500. Montgomery had 219 of the team's 500, which meant Gibbs had 36.4% of the carries, while Montgomery had 43.8%. Now, the biggest thing I think you look at is what Gibbs and Montgomery did last year. Gibbs had 250 out of 534 carries. which is 46.8. Montgomery had 185 of 500 carries, 34.6%. So Gibbs still led the way and still finished tied for 11th in the NFL with his 215 carries or 250 carries, and his 1,400 yards were fifth, 1,412 to be exact, and his 16 touchdowns are tied for first. So he still got the ball a ton. He still had a ton of success. But it was spread around more to the point where David Montgomery had 34.6% of the carries. Gibbs had 46.8%. So Gibbs and Montgomery were both below 50%. They both spread those two out much evenly, as opposed to what the Jets have done with Breece, where it's just been him. So to put it simply, Breece is still going to probably be this team's featured back. He still will be, and he's still going to have more carries than what he's had in previous seasons. But you look at the guys behind him, they're going to get a lot more looks because just as a team, you can expect the Jets this year to run the ball at least 100, 120 more times than they did last year. And that will open up a lot more avenues for Braylon Allen and Isaiah Davis. You're going to see a lot more Braylon Allen in short yardage situations, which should happen. You're also going to see a good chunk of Isaiah Davis. You're also hopefully going to see Breece Hall get a ton more looks as a receiver, which we also saw Gibbs have a ton of success as. So Breece is still going to be the featured back. And I think there could be a good chance you walk away from this season and Breece Hall might have 48% of the carries, and let's say Allen has 35% or something like that. But Breece will still have more carries than he's had last year. There's a good chance he's upwards near, let's say, 240, 250 on the season, which is still a bigger role, but a more even distribution where you're using all of your assets. Something this team, this offense, this coaching staff has not been able to do enough of. So go back to the Aaron Glenn quote. Mentally, he's in a good place, but I would say that we have three running backs. We're going to utilize them much as possible. Yeah, it makes sense because you're coming over from Detroit. You saw them utilize that 1-2 punch. I think you're probably going to see something similar here. I don't think Breece Hall is getting traded. I don't think he's going to lose, his spot on the depth chart to Braylon Allen. No, I think they're going to emulate what they saw in Detroit, which is going to be a much more even distribution, but a lot more opportunities as well because they're going to run the ball a lot more. Sixth most or third most in the NFL last year. Jets were 32nd last. That's a big difference. So that's my take there on Breece Hall. 36.8% last year for Gibbs, 34.6% for Montgomery. I could easily see that being the case this year between Breece and Braylon Allen. Still meaning Breece a lot more carries than he had last year, a lot more opportunities, and utilized in a much bigger way. So that's what I have to say on that. I also think it's important, too, for the Jets to utilize all these running backs. Like the short yardage situations. How many times just in general, even going back to LaFleur, do the Jets have to find themselves in a third and short situation? They overthink it and don't just give it to Braylon Allen. Like or not LaFleur. LaFleur didn't have Braylon Allen, but my point is, even going back to LaFleur where 3rd and 1, like they didn't know what to do. Like you trust this team 3rd and 20 than 3rd and 1. Especially last year, we had Braylon Allen and they wouldn't give him the ball. It's ridiculous. See more of that this year in order to have success. So let me know what you think in the comment section down below. What are your thoughts on Field Yates' mock draft? Membu at 7 and Mason Taylor, 2nd round, 42nd overall. And what are your thoughts on Breece Hall and his new role, whatever you want to call it, future, whatever. Your thoughts on that. So appreciate the support as always. A lot more content coming your way. It's draft month, so we'll of course have a lot of draft talk, a lot of draft discussion here on the podcast. Appreciate the support as always. And yeah, Talk to you soon. Until next time, JETS, 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 Jets.